During the 4th century BC, theatres emerged all over the Greek world. But the irony is that despite this explosion of theatre construction, we don't have a single complete tragedy surviving from this period. After the deaths of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, we are left with nothing but fragments.
It is true the great spread happens in the first half of the 4th century, when every city that had cultural pretensions built a theatre. There seems to be a neat story. Sophocles and Euripides die, and within everybody's perception of it, Nietzsche says that Euripides and Sophocles killed tragedy. So the easy story would be important tragedy came to an end, and sort of mass entertainment spread throughout the Greek world in a rather superficial way. I think it's much more complicated than that. It's really what happens in later antiquity. And the great three become educational set books. And that's really why we have them. And it was those three who were most read. So texts of the other tragedians, they simply weren't copied enough times to survive. It doesn't mean they weren't any good. There were very famous tragedians in the 4th century, people who made a big mark and people who were remembered in later centuries.
The fragments of plays by these writers that have survived support the idea that this was an extremely active era.
One Athenian playwright from this time was called Astydamas the Younger. He was a relative of the great Aeschylus, and he's said to have composed 240 plays during his career, won many first prizes, and even had a statue of himself put up by the Athenians. And what the surviving fragments also allow us is a unique window into how the subject matter of tragedy is changing during this period.
Astydamas wrote a play called Antigone, just like Sophocles and Euripides had done in the 5th century. It again told the story of how Antigone had broken the law by burying her rebel brother and is sentenced to death by King Creon, against the wishes of his son Haemon, who is in love with her. In Sophocles' play, the key moment is the political debate between Creon and Haemon about leadership and justice, and the play ends with Antigone's and Haemon's suicide. In Astydamas' version, Haemon and Antigone run away and have a child together. They are both sentenced to death, but Heracles intervenes to try and save them. It's the same basic story, but the emphasis has shifted.
Well, we've already got the sense in the 5th century of changing myth, where you might have one playwright has already done an Antigone, so you want to change it and make it your own as a playwright. You get that even more in the 4th century. If you imagine they're using the same material, the same myths, but there's a taste for far more elaborate plots. You're still dealing with myth, but the interest has shifted. So in that example of Antigone, you know, the focus there is what happens in that relationship. You hear hardly anything about that relationship in the 5th century version, but in the 4th century, that becomes a real focus.
Is that to do with tragedy's broadening appeal in this period beyond the confines of democratic Athens?
Well, I think the internationalisation is really important because after all, you want this to appeal, but you now have playwrights from all over the Mediterranean coming to compete. And so there's that shift. And of course, the particular political circumstances are different in the different cities. So, I mean, a shift to the romantic themes, domestic, it has a broader appeal.